Hello, everybody, and welcome to this slightly delayed version of When Movies Were Good, featuring your two faithful podcast hosters down here in Melbourne, Australia. I, Rachel, and my special guest, the Jonathan Harris of this podcast, Matthew Dutzer.
What, not good enough for Richard Harris?
Yeah. Joan Collins, maybe?
Well, I might need a glass of wine before I agree to that title.
Yeah, I thought a nice cigar might suit you, or at a nice smoking lounge or something like that.
Well, I won't say no.
You won't say no?
But yeah, I think we did have a good excuse for taking a bit longer to launch this episode, as it took about twice as long to watch all the films. They were both over 3 hours.
Yeah, they don't call these films epics for nothing. So we're doing 1953, The Robe, and 1956's The Ten Commandments, one of the most famous films of all time. Actually, both these films are famous. They fall into the great Hollywood category, especially the classic movie category of epic films along the lines of Ben-Hur, Samson and Delilah. I mean, the list goes on.
Yeah, it's like that great decade of huge films, and you read a lot of histories, and it does kind of cynically describe how a lot of those major efforts in production were to try and combat the competition from television, but I think part of it was also just it was such an optimistic age with big crews in technology that I think you had that certain amount of great directors that were going for the big haul, and the same went on with Cleopatra and others, and so you just had these ones which were so wildly successful, and they sort of, I guess the studios were willing to invest to sort of create really big, powerful films.
Yeah, and especially these biblical style epic films are really, I suppose, the audience back in the 1950s when these two films, films were made. The audience had an interest in seeing these, and the audience was grateful to see these sorts of films. Whereas now, these sorts of films, I notice Netflix and a few other things, they do make films like this, but I just don't think it has the resonance that it had back then because...
Yeah, any overtly religious films, like there was the one that Mel Gibson made, what was it, the Jesus on the Cross or something?
The crucifixion. I know exactly what you mean.
He played Jesus, didn't he?
No, I think that was Jim Caviezel. Oh, The Passion of the Christ.
Okay, did Mel Gibson play Jesus?
No, Jim Caviezel played Jesus. I haven't actually seen it myself.
Okay, so I had this very wrong picture in my mind. I mean, obviously I haven't seen it, so I had this very wrong picture in my mind. But yeah, generally overtly religious films that depict biblical stories tend to be for a much more confined audience these days. The stories that you see in the ones we're reviewing this week are, yes, they have the moral content, or moral's such a strong word, like the inspirational message, but it's kind of assumed that the audience probably has a lot more background knowledge.
Yes, exactly right.
And also that in both of these, but particularly in the Ten Commandments, they try to make it sound very biblical. Now, I tend to go for much more lean and mean preference in my dialogue. Yes. But you kind of get where they were coming from.
Yeah, I mean, again, not to take anything away from both of the films, they probably could be a little bit shorter because there's only so much. I mean, with these biblical historical, unless you're going to make some massive mini-series over the course of 3 months or something.
Well, DeMille himself admitted at the beginning of Ten Commandments.
Yeah.
Yes, the story takes 3 and something hours. There will be an intermission. So that was when the director himself creates his own appearance at the beginning of the movie to warn people that we sympathise with your bladders and we're going to give you an opportunity to go.
Yeah, but in the era of when movies were good, these were it was an all-day investment of your time. You got dressed up, you went out to the cinema, which is not just like schlepping up to the local shopping centre and going to the movies now. It was a true outing, and occasionally here in Melbourne at a certain theatre called the Astor Theatre, they still actually will air the films the way that they were done back then with the intermission and the outro, intro music, all that. And it's just such a great time out because you know you're going to get that break and then come back in fresh for the second half.
Yeah. I mean, there was a variety of ways to go to the movies back then. I mean, there were also little kids that stuck into a theatre to see a scandalous film noir that they probably shouldn't all. And of course, there were those that took advantage of the darkness of the back row as well.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, I mean, I suppose as time marched on, it was less of a special thing to go to the movies, especially by the time the 60s kind of approached, the era of drive-in cinemas and things like that. But it still was more of, I hate to think that, cinema going is dying off because sitting at home just, it doesn't do it for me a lot of the time. But
well, I think people are going to be doing it back with a vengeance. I do need to see my optometrist, though. I'm noticing my eyes seem to strain a bit at movie screens lately. So, yes, Doc, you've got to help me. I need to improve my movie experience.
Yeah. So we're going to launch into The Robe, which is a 1953 American biblical epic film, which we've discussed. So basically, this one is one of Richard Burton, and how we cannot miss Richard Burton's voice. Just the voice alone is a fantastic selling point for him in this film. His voice is so remarkable, and just that's Richard Burton straight away. So basically, he plays the lead character in this film, and essentially, it's set in ancient Rome, and the time period is 32 to 38 AD. And we've got the beautiful Jean Simmons, who is absolutely spectacular in this film. She and Marcellus were involved with each other at some point or time. And basically the story is more about Burton's character of Marcellus, and he is involved with the crucifixion of Jesus. And after that happens to him, a robe comes into his possession, or he comes around the robe that Jesus had before he died, and it causes all sorts of problems for him until he goes on a journey himself and comes to some very different conclusions about life and death, good and bad, all sorts of things, and regarding some of the historical elements of what was happening in the Roman Empire at that time. Matt, what are your thoughts on The Robe?
Well, it's been a long time since my grandparents dragged me to Sunday Mass, so I can't really call myself a perfect authority in all the religious details. I do have a archaeology background, but even that is a bit sketchy in this period because I know much more about the Roman Republic, which reached its final phase about 100 years before now, or maybe even only 50. It was around the time when you went from Caesar to Augustus and stuff. It's quite complicated.
Yeah.
But I found that this film aged a lot better than the Ten Commandments. For one thing, it doesn't go too hardcore with the special effects. It's much more old-fashioned in its approach, in that it used sort of music to mark the big moments, and as well as very large Roman sets, and so it's not relying so much on complex special effects like we see in the Ten Commandments. And so in many ways, in an age when we're so used to seeing a variety of complex methods done to create whole worlds with the touch of a button, it's probably aged ironically a lot better because it just didn't try too hard with the visual spectaculars. In a way, also, I found part of because even you don't have to be overtly religious to appreciate a story that has a bit of a good moral idea. And sorry, again, I fell into that trap where using the word moral, which is such a strong word, but simply the idea that you can encourage to be nice to each other. Admittedly, for both of these films, it was kind of a bit too big and lavish for my taste a lot of the time. I love the battle scenes and the Ten Commandments and the like, but as far as you can tell that both directors still wanted to have a sort of their Sermon on the Mount moment, and for that, personally, I find it's better to have a much more simpler format, like probably the 5 minutes in my life when I've thought about religious vocation professionally was when I watched On the Waterfront, when you simply have that local priest working in a corrupt union-controlled dockyard, and he's helping someone in that situation. And so that much more humbler setting, for me, worked a lot better. And in an age when people are a lot more cynical and they're not as much used to thinking in those big biblical narratives, it may not sort of appeal to their hearts in the right way. But I did find them to be visually fascinating films, but they aren't just flashy substance of battles. Like I first saw the Ten Commandments, and when I got the DVD to do a presentation for a tutorial when I was talking about Egyptian chariots.
Yeah.
And so that big battle scene with the Red Sea was perfect for it.
Yes.
But it isn't just a simple theatrics. They do have quite a good heart to them.
Yes, they do. Just purely from an entertainment perspective, I did enjoy this film. I thought some of the... I absolutely love Gene Simmons, and just such a beautiful, yet another British performer that came across to Hollywood after being seen over there, much like my beloved... You know who I'm talking about? He was in the...
Boris Johnson? No.
My beloved, who I won't continue, Ray, who I will not, because we're not talking about Ray today, but I always talk about Ray anyway.
Why not?
She found her way over there, and she had started work in British films and then came over to Hollywood after being discovered. She was beautiful. She just, along with Anne Baxter, who we'll talk about in the next film, just really suited the sort of period that they were going for. Richard Burton was overly theatric and really fun in the role. Now, we were talking about, was it Jay Anderson who was playing Caligula? Who was, would give, I don't know, Julian Clary or someone like that a run for their money in terms of the camp factor that he was bringing to the role. But I loved how theatric it was. Actually, a condensed version of some of these films might actually work really well in a big stage production with some flashy special effects. But I think the part I found the most moving in the film was the bits and pieces we actually did see of Jesus himself. And as I was saying to Matt before, that
was beautifully understated, I thought.
That was. It was. We didn't actually see his face, but everybody knew exactly who it was, whether the script had referenced him that way or not. But what with these sorts of films, I was reading a few reviews and, this is historically accurate or inaccurate. The only thing that we can really match to accuracy is the actual Roman and Egyptian history of the pharaohs, of the emperors, etc., and then the fable history that they match to in the Bible. So they've actually got a hard job of marrying both a documented history of people in history, like well-known, Caligula, Pontius Pilate, etc., to actual... Well, I guess Pontius Pilate was he was actually in the government at the time, wasn't he? Yeah. Yeah,
and supposed to have been the one that crucified Christ. I actually remember reading because the church obviously tends to talk much more like politicians these days, and they're trying to say, because one of the main or commonly used prayers in, I don't know if just in the Catholic faith or in a broader Orthodox ones, but they keep referring to Christ who was crucified by Pontius Pilate, and they're trying to say, we're not trying to sort of beat down on Pontius's name, but it's trying to get around this misconception that Judaism had a key role in his crucifixion, and so it's kind of like again the church trying to use Pontius as a politically convenient way to sort of remove the what can easily often cause quite a bit of division and hatred as such a core moment in that faith.
Yeah, I mean, it's sort of... So you take from... Some people would just look at it as purely a cinematic story that they're watching and they enjoy it for the elements, and then other people, of course, will take things a lot more to a deeper level depending on their religious background. So The Robe was directed by Henry Costa and produced by Frank Ross. The screenplay was by Gina Kaus, Albert Maltz and Philip Dunn. And it was based on the book The Robe by Lloyd C. Douglas. And of course, we had some other great people in this cast. We had Victor Mature, who I loved as Demetrius, Michael Rennie, and the music was done by Alfred Newman. The cinematography was Leon Shamroy. And it was released September 16th, 1953, and the running time is 135 minutes. So it's definitely investment of your time, but one worth it. I actually did like this one. I thought it was a beautiful film.
And as we were saying before, if you have a local theatre that does like matinees of these classic epics, try and see them as you can. As they were meant to be in a big theatre. Take my advice, though, if you're prone to needing to go to the bathroom halfway through the movie, don't get salted popcorn if you're going to have a drink or a soda as well, because that actually requires you to go sooner. The salt has a sort of negative effect on your fluid intake, so go for something salt-free in the snack department.
Thanks for sharing.
You're welcome.
And moving right along to the Ten Commandments. Don't you just love the advice that Matt and I dish out? It's so needed. I just feel like our advice is just paramount of importance to
Well,
people.
not many people know that part about popcorn. I mean, really, it's a vicious cycle.
It is. I'm actually a big fan of popcorn. You're just going to be careful of those unpopped kernels, which can wreck your teeth at different points of time.
Well, fun fact, as we go into an Egyptian story, a lot of Egyptians had worn-out teeth because the stone mills that ground the flour for bread often got little bits of stones into the bread, and that's how they got worn-out teeth. Fun facts.
Yeah, well, that is actually a fun fact, because you wonder, actually, you see all these Hollywood actors portraying these, ancient people, and it's like, I don't think their teeth were quite like that. I don't think their eyes were.
In one case, I don't think their wristwatch looked like that.
Yeah, that's true. I don't think the dye job looked like that. So we're going to jump. Now, this film is one of the most famous films of all time in any era, in any country, anywhere around the world. And that's it.
Sorry, the copyright was too much for real music.
We have to do our own special effects here because we're obviously running on a budget. But Ten Commandments, 1956. 3 hours and 40 minutes. Yes, folks, you heard it right. 3 hours and 40 minutes. Released 5th of October 1956. Directed, and his last film, I believe, by the great Cecil B. DeMille. He'd already in 1923 done a silent version, which, once again, we do intend on seeing at some point. And just, the accolades roll in. We had the brilliant Charlton Heston playing Moses. We had Anne Baxter as Nefertari. We had the fantastic Brynner as Ramesses. One of my favourite people, Yvonne De Carlo playing Sephra or Zipra, just depending on how you... And Edward G, who played Dathan. Man, we had we had John Derek in this. We had a lot of fantastic people. Matt, thoughts on the Ten Commandments?
Well, I can understand why it would be one of DeMille's last films, because even if he wasn't quite old as he was at the time, such a film like that would have been bloody exhausting to make.
Well, it was shot partially in location in Egypt, and what we were reading before we went on air, that he had something like 10,000 extras in certain scenes with 15,000 animals. That's enough to drive anyone to
God, that's
drink.
That's a lot of free sandwiches to bring.
This film, it is an investment of time. If you are religious and you do hold the stories of the Bible sacred, this one will be a fantastic film for you to see and an enjoyable experience. Even if you're not that way inclined, if you just want to watch something beautiful, heartfelt, interesting, sure. I mean, there's probably elements of it they could have cut out, a few subplots or whatever, but I mean, I think it was the way it needed to be. I loved Brynner in this film. I love Anne Baxter in this film. I love the look of this film. And I still think that special effect of the Red Sea parting, I was saying to Matt before we went on air, that I was watching a mini documentary of all the Red Sea partings in all the different films, modern, going back to DeMille's first 1923 effort, which was still pretty good. That was the one done with the Jell-O being cut up and them running that backwards. I still think this one is the best one because the CGI stuff just doesn't look that good.
Well, we were talking back in the Titanic episode how the digital footage of the ship in the background, even though it's only 20 years old and was otherwise the most expensive film of its time, I personally don't find it's aged that well. You can sort of tell it's the old computer graphics.
Yeah.
And that's just the thing with the special effects. You think you're cutting ahead of your time, but then you realize that sometimes the best way to make your stuff date quickly is to play with the tech of your time.
Yeah, it just sort of... So we were reading about how so obviously one of the pivotal moments in the story of Moses is his leading, his people out of Egypt, and he's being chased by the Pharaoh of the time, the Brynner's character, and his minions, and they need to get across there. He's able to part the sea. They're able to walk through the middle of this ocean that's parted for them, or the sea rather, sorry. They get to the other side, and just as the Egyptians are chasing them across, then the sea falls inward back the way it was. And so I think they were using matte effects. They were using certain special effects that were spliced into it. Lots of fantastic music to go with it. But it all works together really, really well.
Yeah, it's like you are just bowled over by how it went so convincingly to see the water crashing in on the chariots and everything, and that you were able to sort of keep that suspense as the Hebrews are marching through the water. And you got to feel for Moses, because like every time some other challenge comes through and the people he's saved, and they just keep saying stone him, stone him.
Yeah.
And thinking of that part, because knowing the historical Ramses II, who was in real life one of the most powerful and influential pharaohs of Egypt, he actually in real history went through what was a bit of a career embarrassment, where early in his career he aspired to be another one of the great expansionist pharaohs, and he went on a major campaign. And let's just say he got pulled in by a rather basic counterintelligence trick, and he barely got out of it alive. And when he got back to his capital, he basically created a sort of, let's just say, a very optimistic, semi-fictitious narrative. And this is an episode called The Battle of Kadesh, I believe, or Battle of Kadesh. And pretty much his another army division, crack army division, just saved him in time before he was about to get kicked out up the rear by the Hittites.
Right.
And yes, he created a very he just basically tried to whitewash the whole incident in stone. And I'm just thinking, he probably would have felt the exact same way if his whole army had gotten wiped out by the clashing of the Red Sea. Now, this is kind of when you're doing biblical history, and for those that are kind of that are more lay and don't necessarily have a much knowledge of the history of how a lot of these religious texts come together, a great many of them are sort of a combination of faith text and historical record, and it's just how we're having to bring the two together. Like there are some theories that the moving of the Hebrews through the desert, and in reality this was at a time long before there was actually a distinguishment of the Hebrew peoples within the Semitic population. It was a much broader group at that time, and so a lot of people that have emerged from that since then, like the Palestinians and the Hebrews sort of come from that similar joint background. And that was to do with a period when there was a bit of a power vacuum in Egypt, probably caused by a bit of a famine or something, and so there were these sort of semi-independent communes under the name of the Hyksos peoples, and when Egypt in the central government did regain control, they tried to forcefully remove a lot of them. And so it is a complicated cross between of fact and faith.
Right, but this Ramesses that they talk about...
Ramesses II.
Is Ramesses II. So it's sort of... because apparently they've debated and but many scholars are inclined to accept that Exodus has King Ramesses in mind, Ramesses II in mind.
Yeah, it's interesting because he's actually, as ancient monarchs are looked at, he's actually one of the more revered ones, not only because of the lavish building projects he did of the Temple of Abu Simbel, but he also did one of the first major peace treaties between superpowers with the Hittites, which he did many years after his near-failed campaign with them. And, like, I'm not going to say that he was some Gandhi of his time that was a peace lover. We know very well that he wasn't, and he was probably partially forced into it by political circumstance, but while we know and would think of him, if we only knew from this story, as a tyrant, apparently the UN actually has a copy of that peace treaty he made with the Hittites years later.
Oh, wow.
In one of their displays, because it's regarded as this important document of international unity.
Yeah, it's actually really interesting. Like when you could literally spend years trying to research how, the events of certain things in the Bible fit in with historical events and which leaders they're referring to. What did you think of Charlton Heston as Moses?
Let's start from the beginning. Charlton, as well as his father Seti, they are probably both a lot more American English for the region than most could readily accept now.
Yeah.
I did think Charlton was brilliant in the role. I think they could have probably because they had, when you consider Lawrence of Arabia came out not 10 years afterwards, they could have probably been a bit more sensitive to the region of casting for Seti.
Yeah.
But yeah, Charlton, he did have just the right amount of seriousness. And he wasn't too out there. He was down to earth.
Yeah, I thought I'm sure somebody else could have done a really good job in the role as well. I've been recently watching, those who listen to our podcast know that I watch a lot of 80s TV, especially soaps from that era. And Charlton Heston, one of the last major projects that Charlton Heston worked on he was the star of the Dynasty spin-off, The Colbys. So I sat through the 2 seasons of The Colbys just a few weeks ago, and it was he was quite awkward in that show because you're used to seeing him portray Moses, and, it's Ben-Hur. He was Ben-Hur as well, wasn't he? Yeah.
Didn't he have an appearance in Friends as well?
Yeah, he may have, but he was trying to play this romantic, schmaltzy sort of character. But then there were elements of the character that were sort of epic-like, that he was the head of this conglomerate, this huge business and all the rest of it. And Ricardo Montalban was his, sworn arch enemy. So there were sort of epic factors involved in this show. None of them were pulled off.
Would have been a lousy arch enemy compared to Ramesses II.
I mean, none of them really were successfully pulled off. I mean, Barbara Stanwyck was playing his sister, so that in itself, and then she apparently walked off season 2 because she said it was the biggest load of crap she'd ever worked in. I'm like, Barbara, I'm sure some of the other films you've worked in were more so. But so it was very odd seeing the two of them together and saying this dialogue, which was just typical 80s soap dialogue, but just coming out of their mouths, no. So I suppose I grew up watching Charlton Heston in some miniseries that he did, Chiefs, namely, which I absolutely love and rewatched not that long ago, sort of towards the end of his career. I do remember when the Colbys were on and some of the other appearances he made in the 80s. So he was largely doing television, and so was Jack Lemmon and a lot of other great classic movie actors as well. So it is great to see him in his prime, but it's also great that he kept acting, and like a lot of actors who just loved acting, he just kept going for as long as he could.
Yeah, well, it's good when you see an older actor who's that passionate about it, that they're not just stopping at the 60 mark.
Yeah, exactly. And he was he probably could have, I think someone 10 years younger in that role on the Colbys, he played Jason Colby, would have been better. He was in his late 60s when he was playing Jason, and that was just a little bit too old because he was working opposite Catherine Ross and Stephanie Beacham, who were his love interests, and they were about 20 years younger than him at least. So, maybe not, but it was still, I guess, a coup to get him into that role, and he, believed in what he was doing on the show.
Could you imagine if Sean Connery had sort of done that sort of stuff in his old age?
Yeah, it's actually just amazing because Judith Anderson was in this film, and Judith Anderson did soaps and stuff as well, more daytime soaps in the US. So, I mean, look, it's a job and it's a great place to learn, and it's almost like doing theatre because you're doing a different performance every day.
Yeah.
So,
mind you, to say it's just a job, apparently working on TV series, especially if your role is quite a major one, it can actually be a lot harder work than films.
Oh, absolutely. Especially on like soaps where you're doing new scenes every day, or it used to be like that before they changed the way they were shot. But
although I can say from experience working in as an extra in Neighbours, it is handy if you have the one set that's used all the time.
Yeah.
That's free from weather conditions, because you never had to wait for the tech people to have to reset everything.
Yes, that's true. So if we're going to do a versus, like the Robe versus Ten Commandments, for you, which one did you like more?
Okay, this is... I am probably going to have people come at me in the knife of the knife for saying this, but I actually enjoyed the Robe more than the Ten Commandments.
Yeah, me too.
And this isn't just... it isn't just being... prejudice because of the aging of special effects, but I think that just simply that there was sort of an extra heart in the Robe.
Yeah.
The Ten Commandments, it was a much, even though DeMille obviously had big political vision or big philosophical ambitions as well for Ten Commandments, it just doesn't have the same element to me. And the fact that I wasn't so familiar with a lot of the actors in the Robe, like everybody knows Yul Brynner in the Ten Commandments. That the not having the sort of glitz of the actors still reaching out to me.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and if you watch the Robe, you need to see Demetrius and the Gladiators, because that's essentially the sequel to the Robe. So that's Victor Mature's character, Demetrius, who goes on and he has his clashes with various people in the Roman government. So I haven't seen that one yet either. I agree with Matt. I did prefer the Robe. It's not that I didn't like the Ten Commandments. I really enjoy the Ten Commandments. It is well worth the 3 hours. I feel a little bit like how I do with Gone with the Wind. It's a big investment of time, but it's worth it. So do see the Ten Commandments, but I just felt from start to finish, for me, and I guess having the presence of Jesus in the Robe, we see part of his crucifixion. I mean, Jesus is such an enigmatic character for anyone, anywhere, at any time, even those from different religions. He is the center of anything in any film or book that he is a part of. He is this amazing presence on the page, on the screen. So any film with Jesus being portrayed in it, even though we don't see a lot of Jesus physically, he's just implied more that he's there, or he's walking off the screen, or he's carrying the cross. You don't actually see his face. To me, but the part that I got really emotional about in the Ten Commandments is when that old woman was going to get crushed by the bricks, against the wall. Against the wall.
And they had almost an identical scene in the silent version.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's you got to wonder what kind of foreman would be that stupid.
Yeah, the poor woman. I found that really emotional, and that was one of my favourite sequences in the film when, somebody interjected there and helped her out and all the rest of it, and then obviously Moses stepped in. So I thoroughly enjoyed that aspect of the film. Some of the quieter moments I enjoyed. So 2 films that, if you're interested in classic films, you do need to see them. And
I want to mention one more thing before we wind up, because Yul Brynner, who played Pharaoh Ramses, we often talk about the cameos that a lot of actors make in other films and TV series. To me, I think Yul Brynner did what is probably one of the most important things any major figure has done on the screen, because decades later, he was diagnosed, I believe, with, was it lung or throat cancer?
It was lung cancer.
And he was pretty convinced that his heavy smoking was the cause of it. And he made a commercial to be played after he died with the advice to everyone, whatever you do, don't smoke. So,
that's right. It's a very haunting commercial.
Yeah, it is. And so, as a kind of a nod to him, I'd like to say a tip of the hat to him for doing that message, and we should probably continue that same message to audiences. That's a very sad but necessary thing to say.
Yeah, they occasionally used to play that ad on TV here, and I was quite young when they used to play it, and it was very haunting seeing, because he was quite gaunt and everything. The cancer had really taken a hold of him then, and even just reading about, because he performed the King and the King and I all through his career after he initially played him, and he was sort of still playing him even in the 80s, I think it was, when he passed away, and he was kind of being dragged around the stage by the woman playing Anna because he just physically couldn't do the dance routine with her for Shall We Dance, and just, coming off the stage gasping for air and just looking gaunt, and you don't like to think of somebody like that. So yeah, you're right, it was a good message, and it's good that he had the knowledge and the wisdom to sort of want to share that, because I'm sure it did deter a lot of people from smoking.
Well, you'd hope it did, and people just need to be reminded from that constantly, I suppose.
Yeah. Well, thank you once again for joining us on When Movies Were Good. So we start with someone wrote us a comment, and which is fine, but thank God someone's listening to us. But they sort of had said, what, you don't think such and such is a good movie and this and that. But the premise of the podcast is when movies were good. So all of the movies are good. It's just elements of the films that we like more or less, or did we think it was worth the hype? But compared to what comes out of Hollywood now, all these movies are good.
Exactly. And yes, you will, when you're discussing something, you compare what you like and don't like sometimes, and that it can just be the flow of conversation. Although I think it would be an interesting episode if we were to come up with a theme of two really bad films. Like, could we find from that time period two really bad films and make that the theme of the show?
I'm sure we could. We might have to sort of do some of our own independent watching, and then we'll come back with a film from the era, sort of from the silent era to 1959 that we didn't like. Or we couldn't stand at all and couldn't make it through the film.
Yeah, I find a really bad one.
Yeah, I know they're out there, but still they'll be head and shoulders above anything that Hollywood is producing now. And speaking of current Hollywood films, King Kong versus Godzilla, or Kong versus Godzilla, or whatever, this CGI machination, whatever it is, I will go and see it because I've seen the other modern Hollywood versions. I mean, I don't think it can touch Godzilla can ever be touched unless it's by the Japanese, who just do it so well. But I will be going to see it. And Matt actually suggested doing a theme for our next podcast for When Movies Were Good. So we're going to do 1933 King Kong.
Yes.
We did want to do Godzilla
55, 54.
Yeah.
But it's proving rather hard to find.
It was made by Toho, and, it's such a famous film, but funnily enough, it's not that, at least here in Australia, for us to, unless we buy a copy of it, or which we wouldn't rule out doing, but, so we can't get that readily
I actually haven't seen it in DVD stores either, and that just seems to be how it is in Australia at the moment, because I've been to America and there are streaming services there have a lot of more older films.
Yeah, so if anyone knows where we can actually watch Godzilla, please let us know, being based here in Australia. But we're going to do...
Preferably legal.
Yeah. We're going to do... Whoops, there goes the pen again. We're going to do King Kong 1933 and Invasion of the Body Snatchers 1956, when things start going terribly wrong and some mutated force, comes into the earth, either in the shape of a giant ape or, plants or whatever.
Apparently King Kong was Hitler's favourite film. Now, if that's not a good recommendation, I don't know what is.
Yeah, exactly. And if you've got any ideas for films that we compare that you think might be... We're going to do, some Universal Monsters pairing, obviously Dracula and Frankenstein and Wolfman and Mummy, a few things like that. But there's so many films to go through. But if there's anything that you've got an idea for, please let us know.
Anything that was made up until 1959.
Exactly.
Even if it was played after that year.
Yeah.
That's the time frame we work within.
Yeah, definitely. So in the meantime, I'm Rachel.
I'm Matthew.
And we're watching good movies. Thank you and good night.